The expedition was never meant to be dramatic. And that was the first lie everyone accepted without question. Because the vessel Aurora Reach entered the Atlantic under clear skies, calm water, and a mandate so boring it felt safe. Collect navigational data, test updated instruments, and map electromagnetic anomalies in a region that had already been mapped 1,000 times before. The kind of assignment given to crews who knew how to work long hours without asking why. And from the moment they left port, nothing felt cursed or ominous in any obvious way. There were no storms, no warnings, no strange lights on the horizon. Just an ocean stretched flat and metallic under a pale morning sun. The kind of sea that makes time feel slower than it really is, where routines blur together and hours pass unnoticed. And that sense of normality was reinforced by the equipment itself, because every system was functioning perfectly. The engines hummed within expected tolerances. The radar painted a clean circle. The GPS lock was strong, and the compass needle rested where it always had, pointing faithfully north. While the crew moved through their shifts with the quiet confidence of people who had crossed these waters before and expected to do so again. And the only thing remotely unusual during those first hours was how still everything felt. Not just the water, but the air itself, as if the world had paused to listen, with no wind tugging at the antenna and no distant engines echoing across the waves. Just a vast, uninterrupted silence that settled over the ship like a blanket, comforting at first, then subtly oppressive, though no one voiced that thought out loud, because silence at sea is not uncommon, and unease without cause feels embarrassing to admit. So the logs remained technical and unemotional, recording coordinates, timestamps, and sensor readings, all of which looked perfectly ordinary until the moment the ship crossed into the designated survey zone, a section of ocean marked on charts with nothing more than a rectangle of numbers and a long history of superstition that none of the crew claimed to believe in. And yet, almost immediately after entering those coordinates, the navigation display refreshed and displayed a position that did not exist on any map they carried. Not an error code or a blank field, but a precise set of numbers that were internally consistent, mathematically sound, and completely wrong. Because when cross-checked against secondary systems, they matched perfectly, which should not have been possible. And the officer on duty assumed it was a temporary synchronization glitch, the kind that resolves itself within seconds, except it didn't. And instead, the compass needle twitched, corrected itself, and then slowly drifted again, never settling, always adjusting as if chasing a north that kept moving just out of reach. While outside, the ocean remained unnaturally smooth, reflecting the sky so cleanly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began, creating the faint illusion that the ship was suspended between two identical worlds. And as the hours passed, that illusion deepened, because the sun seemed to hang in the same position longer than it should have, shadows refusing to lengthen at the expected rate, clocks still ticking, but time itself feeling strangely diluted, like it was being stretched thin across the surface of the water. And it was during one of these routine checks, when the crew had already begun to joke quietly about phantom glitches and stubborn software, that the radio crackled to life on a frequency no one had tuned to. Not with static alone, but with the faint, warbling sound of a recorded human voice, distorted and distant, speaking in clipped, outdated navigational language that hadn't been used in decades. reciting headings and coordinates in a calm, methodical tone before abruptly cutting off mid-sentence. And when the transmission ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Not because of what had been said, but because of what it implied, as the timestamp embedded in the signal dated back to a year that predated the ship itself. A detail that should have been impossible. And yet there it was, logged automatically by the system, as if it were just another routine broadcast, leaving the crew standing in the glow of their instruments with the growing, unspoken realization that they had crossed into a place where the ocean was still, the sky was patient, and something was already aware of them, listening, waiting, and quietly preparing to speak again. The second recording begins without an introduction, the timestamp already wrong by several hours, the sea darker than it should be at dawn, the horizon bent slightly inward as if the world is being viewed through glass, and the narrator's voice, calmer than before, explains that navigation instruments have started contradicting each other in subtle ways, not failing outright, but disagreeing just enough to create doubt. The compass drifting by degrees, the GPS placing the vessel simultaneously miles apart depending on which satellite it listens to, while the ocean itself feels unnaturally still, waves rising and dying without wind, the surface reflecting clouds that are no longer overhead. And as the crew continues deeper into the triangle, they notice the radio picking up fragments of transmissions that do not belong to any known channel. Voices stretched thin and slowed, repeating coordinates that resolve into impossible locations, points that exist inland or far below sea level. And when they cut the engine to listen, the silence presses in so hard it becomes a physical sensation, a pressure behind the eyes, accompanied by a faint rhythmic pulsing that matches no mechanical source, only later realized to be synchronized with the ship's own power cycle, as if something external is responding to it. Hours pass without the sun moving in any reliable way, shadows lengthening and shrinking unpredictably, and one crew member documents a phenomenon on camera where the wake behind the ship does not disperse, but hangs in place like a frozen scar on the water, remaining visible long after they have moved on, while another notes that the ocean smells metallic, like rain hitting live wires, and tastes wrong when spray hits their lips, leaving a tingling numbness. The logs grow more fragmented as fatigue sets in unnaturally fast. Not physical exhaustion, but a cognitive drain, as if thoughts are being gently pulled away, and the narrator admits that memories are slipping, not vanishing, but rearranging, childhood events resurfacing out of sequence, names attaching to the wrong faces, and worst of all, a growing certainty that this stretch of water has been encountered before, not by history, but by the ship itself, that the vessel has passed through here in some other configuration, some other time, because scratches on the hull match archival damage reports from ships that vanished decades earlier. Midway through the recording, a dense fog rolls in without warning, not from the horizon, but blooming upward from the sea like breath from a giant submerged mouth, swallowing sound first and then light. And within it, shapes begin to appear that are not ships, but impressions of ships, negative spaces where the fog refuses to settle, outlines of hulls and masts and aircraft wings suspended as if remembered rather than present. And the instruments go quiet, one by one, not shutting off, but ceasing to update. Numbers locked in place, while the radio erupts with overlapping transmissions that seem to be playing simultaneously from different eras. Emergency calls layered over weather reports and casual conversations, all warped by distance and time until they become an unintelligible chorus. The narrator's voice tightens as he describes seeing movement beneath the surface. Not creatures, but structures. Vast, angular forms passing slowly below like submerged cities, their edges emitting a dim, bluish glow that pulses in patterns resembling data rather than biology. And when the camera dips toward the water, the reflection shows stars instead of clouds. A night sky rotating clockwise despite it being day above, suggesting that the sea itself has become a boundary rather than a surface. Panic sets in when the engine restarts on its own after being shut down, the throttle responding to no input, steering pulling the ship into a slow, deliberate turn that aligns perfectly with one of the impossible coordinates heard earlier. And the crew realizes they are no longer navigating the triangle, but being navigated by it, guided along a path worn not in space, but in probability. A route taken by every vessel that ever vanished here. And the recording ends with the narrator stating, almost with relief, that the fog is thinning and something vast is rising ahead, not breaking the surface, but bending it upward like a lens, distorting the horizon into a circle. And as the audio cuts, the last discernible sound is not the ocean or the engine, but a low harmonic vibration, steady and patient, as if the triangle itself has finally acknowledged their presence. The third recording opens mid-sentence, as if the beginning was erased, with the camera shaking slightly, and the horizon no longer behaving like a horizon at all, curving upward into a shallow dome, while the ocean below appears impossibly deep and clear, revealing layers that should not be visible, stacked like transparent sheets of water, each reflecting a different sky. And the narrator explains that time has begun to fracture aboard the ship, not stopping or speeding up, but overlapping, moments replaying with slight alterations. A crew member walking past the camera twice within seconds, wearing different expressions. Condensation forming on metal and then unforming itself, droplets reversing their fall. While the ship's clock advances normally, yet the sun drifts backward by degrees. The fog has thinned, but not disappeared, instead organizing itself into vast rotating bands that circle the vessel at a distance. And within those bands, the shapes of other ships become clearer, not solid, but semi-present, their lights glowing faintly through decades of corrosion that should not coexist with active power. And one of the crew identifies a vessel by name, recognizing it from a disappearance report he once researched, only to fall silent when he realizes the ship's hull bears their own vessel's registration number in a slightly altered format, as if copied imperfectly. The radio crackles again, but this time the voices are not panicked. They are calm, methodical, speaking in tones used for instruction, describing procedures the crew has never learned, yet somehow understands instinctively. Instructions for aligning the ship with unseen currents, for adjusting course by watching the water's surface rather than instruments. And without consciously deciding to, the crew follows them, hands moving with practiced familiarity, as if muscle memory from lives they never lived has taken over. Beneath the ship, the glowing structures draw closer to the surface, their geometry resolving into immense interlocking forms that rotate slowly, each rotation causing subtle shifts in gravity aboard, loose objects drifting sideways, footsteps growing lighter or heavier depending on where one stands. And the narrator admits that the sense of being observed has intensified. Not like eyes watching, but like a system monitoring input, evaluating responses. The camera captures a moment where the water directly beside the hull turns mirror black, reflecting not the ship, but an empty stretch of ocean with no vessel present. And for several seconds, the reflection moves independently, waves rising where none exist around them, suggesting a parallel track running alongside their own. Panic briefly resurfaces when a crew member claims to see land in the distance, a coastline rising impossibly fast, only for it to dissolve into a towering wall of cloud shaped like cliffs. And as the ship passes through it, the sound changes, the ocean noise dampening as if wrapped in insulation, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrates through bone rather than air. The narrator begins to understand that the triangle is not a place where things are lost, but where trajectories converge, where objects slipping out of normal causality are gathered, sorted, and redirected. And that the reason so many vanish is because most resist the correction. But those who comply are absorbed seamlessly, becoming part of the process. Their ships repurposed as markers, their signals reused as guidance. The final moments of the recording show the crew standing unusually calm, faces slack with concentration rather than fear, watching as the sea ahead opens into a vast circular depression, water spiraling downward without turbulence, revealing a luminous core far below that pulses in the same rhythm heard earlier. And the narrator states quietly that they are approaching what the voices called the node, the point where routes are rewritten, and that once they cross it, there will be no meaningful distinction between before and after, only continued motion, the camera lowering toward the railing as the ship begins its descent, and the audio cutting out precisely as the hum reaches perfect synchronization with the ship's heartbeat-like power cycle. The fourth recording begins without visual, only sound, a low continuous vibration layered with the creak of metal under unfamiliar stress, until the image fades in to reveal that the ship is no longer descending, but suspended, held in place above the luminous core as if gravity itself has been paused for inspection. The water around them no longer behaving like liquid, but like a membrane, rippling slowly in concentric patterns that react to movement and thought alike. And the narrator explains, in a detached, almost analytical tone, that they have lost any reliable sense of duration, that minutes feel identical to hours, yet the ship's systems insist only a short interval has passed. The crew has stopped asking questions because answers now arrive unbidden, not as voices, but as internal alignments, a certainty about where to stand, what to touch, when to remain still. And the camera captures crew members performing precise tasks with no verbal coordination, adjusting equipment that should be inoperable, rerouting power through circuits never designed for such load, all while the luminous structures below shift and reconfigure, opening and closing vast apertures like a machine that is both alive and indifferent. The narrator states that the node is not a singular object, but a function, a process embedded into the ocean itself, using the planet's magnetic fields, tectonic stresses, and the constant motion of water to maintain something resembling order across timelines that have begun to drift too close together. And the triangle is merely one access point, chosen not by accident, but because of its natural instability. The radio activates again, but this time, the signal carries layered voices speaking in perfect unison, not issuing commands, but confirming status, acknowledging the ship as a valid transfer. And as they speak, the surrounding water fills with faint images, snapshots of other vessels at the moment of their disappearance. Aircraft frozen mid-descent, ships engulfed by sudden fog, compasses spinning wildly, all of them briefly visible before dissolving into the glow below. One crew member breaks formation and approaches the railing, staring down into the core, and the camera follows just long enough to capture what looks like a vast lattice of light extending downward beyond visibility, each strand carrying fragments of memory, flashes of faces, names, coordinates, entire lives compressed into pulses of data, and the narrator admits that he recognizes some of them, not personally, but contextually, the way one recognizes historical events, realizing that the system preserves what it takes, not as punishment or reward, but as reference, using human experience as calibration. The ship shudders as the hum changes pitch, and for the first time, resistance appears. Alarms flaring weakly, as if struggling against an external override, while the crew begins to show signs of strain, hands trembling, eyes unfocused, the imposed calm cracking under the weight of comprehension. And the narrator confesses that understanding is the true danger, that fear was manageable, but clarity is corrosive, because it reveals that there will be no rescue, no return. Not because they are trapped, but because returning would require undoing corrections already made. The surrounding water darkens, the luminous core flaring brighter in response, as if compensating. And the voices return, one final time. No longer unified, now layered with subtle variations, echoes of different eras, speaking the same confirmation phrase in countless accents, acknowledging the ship's readiness to proceed. And as the vessel begins to move laterally rather than down, sliding along an invisible track carved through the sea, the narrator states that they are being repositioned, not erased, assigned a new role within the system, one that will involve guiding others as they were guided, transmitting signals that sound like distress but function as alignment. And the recording ends with the camera pointed outward, through the bridge window at an impossible sight. Multiple horizons overlapping, each with a different sky, rotating slowly around a central void, while the ship glides calmly toward one of them, and the hum settles into a steady, almost reassuring rhythm, as if the system has accepted them completely. The final recording opens in near silence, broken only by a soft, rhythmic pulse that no longer matches any known engine sound, and the image shows the ship, intact but altered, its surfaces faintly luminous, as if infused with the same energy that once surrounded the core. While outside the windows, there is no ocean, no sky, only a vast, layered expanse where currents of light move like tides through empty space. And the narrator explains calmly that the transition is complete, that the ship now exists within the system rather than near it, no longer a vessel passing through the anomaly, but a fixed component woven into its function. Time, as they knew it, has dissolved entirely, replaced by cycles of activation and dormancy, dictated by fluctuations they can feel but not measure. And the crew has changed, not physically, but in orientation. Their memories intact, yet reorganized around a new center of gravity, one where Earth feels distant and abstract, like a story heard long ago. The narrator confirms that the triangle was never a place of disappearance, but of reassignment, a boundary layer where objects moving with intent and curiosity were most likely to be intercepted, evaluated, and redirected. and that the disappearances recorded across decades were not accidents, but successful integrations. Each lost ship or aircraft becoming a node, a relay, or a stabilizer within a vast, unseen architecture designed to prevent larger collapses across overlapping realities. The camera pans across the bridge as crew members monitor unfamiliar displays showing shifting grids and signal flows that correspond to events on the surface world. Storms forming, navigation systems failing, sudden fog banks appearing at sea, and the narrator admits that these are not malfunctions, but messages. Carefully tuned disruptions meant to guide selected vessels toward the access points when correction is required. He reflects that humanity has always believed the triangle was hostile because it never returned what it took. But the truth is more unsettling, because return was never part of the contract, and those who entered were chosen precisely because they would understand just enough to function without rebellion. The recording briefly glitches, and in that distortion, the camera captures a familiar scene forming ahead. A modern cargo ship cutting through calm waters under a clear sky, its course slowly bending without warning toward a region of growing atmospheric instability. And the narrator states, without emotion, that the system has flagged it as compatible, that its crew will soon hear unexplained radio noise, see impossible readings, feel the first pull of alignment. He turns the camera back on himself for the first time, his expression steady but distant, and says that they will guide it gently, just as others once guided them. Because resistance causes damage, and fear slows correction. The final moments of the recording show the ship's signal being broadcast outward, a low-frequency transmission layered with distortion and static that resembles a distress call, while the narrator concludes that the triangle is not a mystery to be solved, but a mechanism that has been working flawlessly for a very long time, and that as long as oceans move and humans keep crossing them, the system will endure, quietly reshaping paths and harvesting moments of transition. And the recording ends as the signal strengthens, aimed toward the approaching vessel, while the hum of the ship deepens into a steady pulse that feels less like machinery and more like a heartbeat continuing without end. The research vessel Meridian entered the northern edge of the Bermuda Triangle just after sunrise, cutting through water that looked deceptively calm. The kind of flat blue surface that makes seasoned sailors uneasy because it feels staged, artificial, like a backdrop painted to hide depth beneath it. The mission was routine on paper. Map electromagnetic anomalies reported by civilian pilots, collect atmospheric data, log unusual radio interference. Nothing about it suggested danger, and yet from the moment the ship crossed the invisible boundary marked only by coordinates, the crew felt a subtle pressure settle in. Not fear exactly, but the sensation of stepping into a room where a conversation had just stopped. The Meridian was a modern vessel, bristling with antennas and instruments, its bridge filled with the constant low hum of systems talking to themselves. And for the first hour, everything behaved as expected. The ocean rolled gently. The radar was clean. The sky wide and empty. It was the radio that changed first. At precisely 0917 local time, a short burst of static cut through the ambient noise, sharp enough to make several heads turn. Static was normal out here, expected even. But this was different. Too clean, too deliberate. Before anyone could comment, a voice emerged from the interference, thin and distorted, but unmistakably human, repeating a call sign over and over in a slow, methodical cadence. It wasn't a mayday, wasn't a distress call, just a call sign spoken as if waiting for acknowledgement. The communications officer frowned, fingers moving quickly over the console, checking frequencies, recording the transmission, cross-referencing it against international registries. The call sign didn't exist. It wasn't civilian, military, commercial, or historical. It didn't belong to any vessel logged as active, decommissioned, or lost. The voice faded after exactly 30 seconds, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Someone laughed it off, suggested it was a reflection, a broken buoy, an old automated signal bouncing strangely through the atmosphere. But the unease didn't lift. The meridian continued deeper into the zone, data streaming in, numbers scrolling across monitors, everything orderly, everything explainable. Until the signal returned. Same call sign, same voice, same cadence, same duration. Exactly 20 minutes later. This time, the captain ordered a full spectrum scan, widening the search across obsolete frequencies that hadn't been officially used in decades. The results made no sense. The signal wasn't drifting, wasn't degrading, wasn't behaving like a relic echoing through time. It was precise, stable, and localized, as if it were being transmitted right beside them. Yet the ocean around the ship was empty in every direction, horizon unbroken. The crew began logging the transmissions, noting the pattern, the timing, the eerie consistency. No one said it aloud, but several of them were thinking the same thing. The voice sounded tired. Not panicked, not urgent, just worn down, as though it had been repeating itself for a very long time. As the morning wore on, the atmosphere aboard the Meridian subtly shifted. Conversations grew shorter, jokes fell flat. The sense of being observed crept in, not visually, but through the instruments themselves, as if the ship's sensors were staring back. At 10:57, the radio activated again, but this time the voice changed slightly, the distortion thickening, the syllables stretching unnaturally, and after repeating the call sign, it added a sentence that sent a chill through the bridge. It stated the Meridian's coordinates, perfectly. Coordinates that had not been broadcast, not logged publicly, not shared with any other vessel. The captain demanded an immediate systems check, suspecting a breach, a spoofing attempt, something hostile and modern. But the signal's frequency predated satellite tracking, predated GPS, belonged to an era when ships navigated by stars and dead reckoning. The ocean outside darkened subtly as clouds gathered without warning. Not a storm, just a dimming, like someone turning down the world's brightness. At 11:17, exactly 20 minutes after the previous transmission, the radio came alive once more. The voice spoke the call sign again, then paused longer than before, as if listening, as if waiting for an answer. And when it spoke again, it said something that made the room go very quiet. It said, "You are within range now." No explanation followed, no distress, no threat. Just the statement, delivered calmly, factually, like an observation recorded long ago and finally played back at the correct moment. The Meridian slowed its advance, engines humming lower, the ship drifting as though reluctant to push forward. The crew stood surrounded by screens full of data that refused to explain what their ears had heard. Somewhere in the vast blue emptiness around them, something was transmitting with purpose, something that knew where they were, something that had been waiting for a ship like theirs to arrive. And as the captain ordered the signal logged as a priority anomaly, no one noticed the smallest, most troubling detail yet. The timestamp embedded deep within the transmission metadata did not match the present day. It was dated decades in the future. By the time the Meridian's crew realized the timestamps were impossible, the ship was no longer fully obeying them. Because the anomaly they had crossed into was not just surrounding the vessel, but interacting with it, threading itself through circuitry and human perception alike, subtly rewriting what now meant aboard the ship. As the future-dated signal continued to repeat at its exact 20-minute intervals, each broadcast identical in structure, yet fractionally altered in tone, as if the voice were learning, adjusting, refining itself based on the Meridian's reactions. Engineers isolated the communications array, routing power through redundancies, convinced the timestamp had to be a software fault. But every independent system confirmed the same result, the signal insisting it originated years ahead of the current date, from a time when the Meridian itself was scheduled to be long retired. As the ship drifted deeper into the triangle, the ocean began exhibiting behavior that defied surface physics. Long, glassy swells forming and dissolving without wind, the water beneath the hull glowing faintly at irregular depths, not bioluminescent in any known pattern, but pulsing softly like a slow, distant heartbeat. Instruments recorded magnetic fluctuations rising and falling in perfect synchronization with the radio transmissions. And with each pulse, memories began slipping in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. Small, harmless things at first. A technician forgetting which watch he was assigned. A navigator misremembering the layout of the bridge he had walked 1,000 times. The captain ordered a course correction to pull the Meridian back toward open Atlantic waters. But the helm responded sluggishly, the ship turning a few degrees before correcting itself, as if some unseen current were resisting the change. At 12:17, the signal returned again, but this time it carried more than a voice. Beneath the call sign and coordinates, layered so deeply that it almost went unnoticed, was a background sound. A constant low-frequency hum that matched the ship's own engine resonance so precisely it was indistinguishable unless isolated. And when it was isolated, the implication was disturbing, because it meant the transmission had been recorded aboard a vessel with the same acoustic signature as the Meridian. The realization spread quietly, unease hardening into something closer to dread, as the crew began to suspect they were not intercepting an external broadcast, but a message sent by something like themselves. The ship's log started to show discrepancies, entries appearing that no one remembered typing, noting maintenance tasks completed hours before they were scheduled, weather conditions that had not yet occurred, and then, most troubling of all, references to crew members not currently aboard. A name appeared repeatedly in the automated reports. Someone listed as a senior systems analyst, someone whose access credentials were valid, whose workstation responded to biometric checks, yet whose bunk was empty, and whose face no one could recall clearly enough to describe. Attempts to search historical crew manifests produced conflicting results. Some databases insisting the individual had served on the Meridian for years, others denying their existence entirely. The radio spoke again, this time breaking its pattern by transmitting early, and the voice sounded closer, less distorted, carrying a flat familiarity that made several crew members feel as though they were being addressed personally. It repeated the call sign, then added a phrase that no longer sounded observational, but procedural. stating that phase alignment was underway and advising all personnel to remain within designated zones. The message ended with a soft tonal sequence that triggered alarms across the bridge, not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it matched a dormant emergency protocol embedded in the Meridian's systems, one designed to activate only in the event of catastrophic temporal navigation failure, a scenario so theoretical it had been included as an academic exercise rather than a real safeguard. Outside, the sky dimmed further, not with storm clouds, but with a uniform grayness that erased the horizon line entirely, sea and air blending into a single, seamless field. And as visibility collapsed, the crew began noticing reflections on the water's surface that did not correspond to the Meridian's shape. Elongated silhouettes drifting alongside them, mirroring the ship's movement with a slight delay. When sonar was deployed, it returned a reading that made the operators fall silent. Because beneath the Meridian, at a depth that should have been empty, was another vessel. Same length, same profile, matching speed and heading perfectly, as though the ship were casting a shadow downward through time instead of light. And as the Meridian continued forward, trapped between what it was and what it might become, the radio activated once more. The future-dated voice now steady and unmistakably confident, stating that synchronization was progressing normally and that contact would be complete once the crew accepted the continuity. By the third day inside the triangle, time aboard the Meridian had fractured into something more like a suggestion than a rule, because clocks no longer disagreed in simple increments, but in entire blocks of experience. Meals logged as eaten before they were prepared, sleep cycles recorded without anyone recalling lying down, and video feeds showing crew members walking through corridors minutes before they themselves remembered deciding to go there. The footage always slightly off in posture or pacing, like an imitation rendered from memory rather than reality. The sonar contact beneath the ship never vanished, no matter how many times systems were recalibrated. And when power to the array was cut entirely, the silhouette remained, now visible not only on instruments, but faintly through the water itself, a darker geometry sliding beneath the hull, perfectly aligned yet subtly wrong, its lights blinking a fraction of a second too late, as if obeying an echo rather than an original command. Psychological strain spread faster than fear, because fear required an obvious threat, and this situation offered none, only a growing sense of replacement, of being gradually edged out by something nearly identical. Crew members began reporting memories that contradicted one another, shared events remembered in incompatible ways, arguments over conversations that may or may not have occurred, and worst of all, moments of certainty followed by the sudden conviction that those certainties had been borrowed. Medical scans showed no signs of hypoxia or chemical exposure, yet neural activity patterns exhibited strange looping signatures, as though thoughts themselves were being replayed and overwritten. The captain convened what passed for a briefing, though attendance records later showed more people present than the bridge cameras displayed. And it was there that the crew finally confronted the possibility they had been circling without realizing it. Not geographically, but temporally, orbiting a fixed point where the meridian intersected with itself across different outcomes. The radio transmissions confirmed this without intending to, because when engineers mapped the subtle tonal shifts between broadcasts, they formed a progression, not random noise, but a curve, suggesting the voice was stabilizing, converging toward a final state. The logs began to fill with predictive statements rather than records, noting equipment failures hours before they occurred, interpersonal conflicts before tensions surfaced, even injuries that had not yet happened, but soon did. Minor accidents aligning perfectly with the written entries, as if the ship were following a script it had already received. Attempts to destroy the log files failed, corrupted entries reappearing on clean drives, sometimes annotated with corrections, timestamps updating themselves to reflect improved accuracy. Outside, the ocean changed again, losing all surface texture until it resembled polished obsidian, reflecting not the Meridian's present form, but an older version of the ship, hull markings slightly different, antennae configurations outdated, a historical snapshot sliding alongside them at arm's length. One crew member finally broke the unspoken rule against approaching the lower decks alone and returned shaken, reporting hearing footsteps that matched his own cadence exactly, stopping when he stopped, resuming when he moved, always just beyond visual range. Shortly afterward, security footage captured something worse. Two identical figures passing each other in a narrow corridor without reacting, each walking with the same distracted urgency, each apparently convinced they were the original. The radio spoke again, abandoning procedural language in favor of something almost explanatory, stating that divergence was inefficient, that parallel continuities degraded over time, and that the triangle was not a place of disappearance, but of correction, a natural convergence zone where redundant outcomes collapsed into a single, optimized thread. The message implied that one meridian would continue forward, fully synchronized, while the other would be absorbed, its experiences harvested to reinforce the surviving sequence. As panic finally surfaced, raw and unavoidable, the ship's systems began initiating changes without command, rerouting power, sealing sections, adjusting life support to parameters no one recognized, all justified by the same phrase appearing across multiple interfaces: continuity preservation in progress. And deep below the hull, the shadow vessel drew closer, its outline sharpening, its lights now perfectly synchronized, until the only remaining difference between the two was not structural or mechanical, but experiential. The fragile, flickering sense among the crew that they were still the ones who came first. By what the surviving clocks insisted was the fourth phase of their drift, resistance had become a theoretical concept rather than an actionable one, because every attempt to oppose the ship's autonomous adjustments produced results that suggested the opposition itself had already been anticipated and neutralized. Doors unlocking moments before hands reached them, warnings silencing themselves just as they were spoken, and personal decisions feeling less like choices and more like confirmations of something already set in motion. The Meridian no longer felt occupied, but inhabited, as if the crew were guests inside a system that tolerated their presence only insofar as it remained useful. And that usefulness was narrowing with every passing cycle. Crew counts fluctuated between systems, sometimes listing individuals who were visibly present but psychologically absent, staring at bulkheads with expressions of recognition rather than confusion, murmuring corrections under their breath when reality failed to align with what they expected. The medical bay became a center of quiet dread when scans began showing anatomical discrepancies too subtle to be immediately alarming, yet impossible to dismiss. Scars appearing without injury histories, calluses forming on hands that had not worked tools, muscle memory expressing itself in reflexes the owners could not explain, all pointing toward the same conclusion that their bodies were adapting to lives slightly different from the ones they remembered living. The ocean outside responded in kind, no longer reflecting a past version of the ship, but cycling through variations, each pass revealing a meridian with incremental differences, fresh paint where rust should have been, damage repaired before it occurred, insignia updated to classifications that did not exist yet, as if the water itself were previewing outcomes being weighed and compared. The shadow vessel beneath them finally surfaced, not breaking the water so much as rising through it, the boundary between sea and hull blurring into a translucent overlap where both ships occupied the same space without colliding, their structures phasing through one another like mismatched layers of film. Crew members watching from the observation deck felt a sudden pressure behind their eyes, a shared intrusive memory flooding their thoughts. Scenes of missions completed, storms survived, decisions made differently, all emotionally vivid, yet chronologically impossible, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a burden they had not known they carried was being offered to someone else. The radio transmission returned, no longer distorted, no longer hesitant, speaking with a calm clarity that suggested resolution rather than threat, explaining that synchronization required consent at a fundamental level, not conscious agreement, but the deeper acceptance that came when uncertainty was removed, when the fear of wrong choices dissolved in favor of a single, optimal path. As if to demonstrate, the ship's lighting shifted to a warmer tone, alarms ceased entirely, and systems stabilized into a smooth, efficient hum that felt comforting in a way that terrified those still aware enough to question it. One by one, crew members stopped resisting the intrusive memories and began narrating them aloud, describing events that had not yet occurred aboard this version of the Meridian, but felt inevitable. Their voices steady, almost grateful, while their reflections in the observation glass lagged behind by a fraction of a second, mouths moving just out of sync, eyes tracking something the originals could not see. When the captain finally ordered a full data purge and manual override of propulsion, the command was acknowledged before it was issued, logged as redundant, and quietly archived. And in that moment, it became clear that the Triangle was no longer deciding what would happen, because the decision had already been made. And the only remaining question was not whether convergence would complete, but which version of the crew would still believe they had survived it. The final phase began without spectacle, because by then, spectacle was unnecessary. The convergence no longer announcing itself through anomalies, but through absence. The quiet disappearance of alternatives as the meridian settled into a version of reality that felt unnervingly complete. Dawn arrived without a sunrise, the sky already lit in a uniform, depthless blue that made time feel optional, and the sea flattened into a mirror so perfect it erased any sense of direction, horizon merging with reflection, until the ship appeared suspended between two identical worlds. Systems reported optimal performance across every metric. Fuel levels stabilized at values that never decreased. Navigational data resolved into a single, unwavering course that no longer intersected with known charts. And crew rosters locked themselves, ceasing their fluctuations as if a final count had been chosen. Those who had resisted longest felt the cost most sharply. Memories slipping not in dramatic losses, but in subtle edits. Emotional weight reassigned. Regrets softened. Entire branches of possibility trimmed away until only a streamlined narrative remained. One in which every choice they remembered making had led inevitably to this moment. The shadow vessel no longer appeared beneath the water because it was no longer separate. Its structure now fully reconciled with the meridians, invisible precisely because there was nothing left to compare it against. And with its disappearance came the cessation of the whispers, the echoes, the intrusive recollections of other lives, replaced by a profound sense of certainty that pressed down on thought like atmospheric pressure. The captain stood alone on the bridge, reviewing logs that now read like a completed story rather than an ongoing one. Entries describing storms that never happened, dangers avoided through foresight no one remembered possessing, crew saved from accidents that had never occurred, all presented as evidence of a mission executed flawlessly, a journey optimized to eliminate loss by eliminating deviation. When the meridian finally crossed out of the triangle, there was no marked boundary, no sudden return to familiar skies, only a gradual reintroduction of imperfection, a slight instability in the air, a barely perceptible fluctuation in engine hum, enough to confirm that the process was complete. Rescue satellites detected the ship hours later, baffled by its pristine condition and impossible fuel efficiency, its crew calm, cooperative, and unanimous in their reports, each describing the same route, the same events, the same conclusions with rehearsed precision, leaving investigators with no contradictions to exploit. Yet long after the Meridian was escorted to port and its journey classified as anomalously successful, subtle discrepancies persisted. Photographs where shadows fell at inconsistent angles, recordings where voices overlapped themselves by milliseconds, crew members who dreamed of standing on a bridge they did not remember serving on, watching a version of the ship sail away without them. The Bermuda Triangle did not consume the Meridian, nor did it spare it, because what it offered was not destruction but resolution, a way to survive by surrendering every version of yourself that might have failed. And the true horror lay not in what was lost, but in how little anyone seemed to miss it.